Three 16-year-old girls were talking. The first one said, my daddy loves me so much that for my 16th birthday, he gave me a brand new Mustang convertible to get all around town. The second girl said, well, that's nothing. My daddy's the president of the biggest bank in town. He told me he didn't want my little feet to ever get tired, so he gave me a new Corvette to get around town in. Third girl was the preacher's daughter. She said, well, that's no big deal. I told my daddy what you two had to get around town in, and my daddy looked at me, he kissed my forehead, and he said, honey, I love you so much. I want to honor you deeply. I'm going to let you get around town the same way Jesus did. Sometimes we think we have it all figured out, but we really don't, right? This summer, we were on a vacation. Every summer, we take one half of our grandkids on a trip with us. This summer, it was the Oklahoma City crew, Luke and Allie, and we were traveling. And we ended up at a table with some other families eating, and they were very complimentary of Luke and Allie. Luke and Allie are very social. They can carry on a conversation with adults, have been able to do that all their lives. But after a while, the kids got up to go play a game, and we were sitting there, and a very nice gentleman leaned over, and in a very forceful way and demanding way said, talking about Luke and Allie, said, are they saved? Now, there's enough of the redneck in me that there's a part of me wanting to say, well, you know what? Yes, they are, in more colorful language than that. But I'm wondering if you are going to need someone to save you here in the next couple minutes. Now, I wanted to say, yes, they are. I baptized them myself. If that's not good enough for you, they know their faith. They talk about their faith. They go to church all week long. They can get up in front of 2,000 people and share their faith. They can get up in front of 2,000 people and sing a Christian song, give their witness. These are awesome, amazing, brilliant kids. But what I said was, after I swallowed my tongue, yes, they are, but probably not in the way you mean. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a church with a list. And there was a list of who was in and who was out of the kingdom of God. Right? If you didn't grow up in a church like that, you may have created one on your own. Right? That guy that cuts you off in traffic, not on the list. That person who wouldn't recommend you for a promotion, not on the list. That girl who wouldn't go out with you to the high school prom, not on the list. That politician that just makes you want to hold your nose every time they come on the TV, which is almost every day, not on the list. That in-law you have to see twice a year, they're not on the list, right? Well, my church growing up had a list. Catholics weren't on it. No Catholics on the good list. Which made me cry and made me leave that church because half my family is Catholic. Good as Christian people as you'll ever know in your life. Baptists were on the list. Methodists weren't. Presbyterians weren't. Disciples of Christ weren't. None of them were on the list. And most certainly and positively, Jews were not on the list. Somewhat ironic, since Jesus was never baptized and didn't join any Christian church. Sort of makes you wonder about that one a little bit. But no Jews. Ironic, since I have a Jewish name and part of my family is Jewish. So I'm not real comfortable with the list thing. I got to tell you that when people say to me, Pastor, do you think so-and-so is going to hell? My typical answer is, I can't really answer that. I am in marketing, not accounting. And there are no transfers between departments as far as I can tell. My job is to make sure people know they are on the list, not to keep people off. It's sort of like when I was a school teacher and we would go on field trips. The single most important job description thing I had in doing that, and all the teachers know it, make sure you come back with the exact same number you took, right? Don't come back with less. I never came back with less. Don't come back with more. Twice I came back with more, and that's a problem also. Fill your list. Make sure you fill your list. Nicodemus had a list. Nicodemus had a list. He had a list that he had been preparing since he was a child. How do I know this? Because I know the way in which Nicodemus was schooled. All Jewish children were put into school, learned to read or write. They moved into a stage, and some of the elder people would come along and say to a few of them, okay, you're done with school. You're done with school. We have some rocks over here for you to count. And we have some sticks over here for you to pile up. You're done with the rest of school. You don't have to go to school anymore. They would go on a little further, and then they would come back, and they would make the group a little bit smaller. They'd say, okay, you've done a nice job. We have some work for you cutting up the sheep for dinner and getting the quails and things ready for the sacrifice. That will be your job. And this would go on and on, one cut after another, until they get to the final cut, and they cut away the final cut, and the ones left over were the exceptional ones. They became the religious teachers. And Nicodemus was one of them. When all the chaff had been cleared away, Nicodemus stood tall. He was a part of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are very interesting people. They were somewhat, you'd probably say, conservative in the way that they looked at things, but they could be fairly flexible. At the time of the story where he goes to visit Jesus, they are a minority group. There are about half a dozen other political parties that are much larger than them, the largest being the Sadducees, and the Sadducees run the temple. And the Sadducees have great influence. But the Pharisees, even though they're small, they're very brilliant. They're the most learned people. That's why I wore my academic hood today, so you kind of think maybe a little Nicodemus thing going on here. I have 2 doctorate degrees, and the best thing about it is if I go to those universities, I know where the restrooms are. That's what you get out of that. But they were in the real academic group. Now, here's what happens over the course of the next few years. After the crucifixion of Jesus, the temple is wiped out. The Sadducees are wiped out. The Pharisees survive by moving their headquarters to the west side of the Sea of Galilee up by Tiberias, a Roman city. And they make it and they survive. And the Judaism that exists right now today, if you go next Friday to a house of worship, a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue, the kind of worship you will experience will be the kind the Pharisees created back in the time of Jesus. That's what you will experience. That's the Pharisaic Judaism is the only kind that survives. So they were very brilliant, they were very tough, they were very smart, they were very wise, they could read the political winds, so to speak. And so it says that Nicodemus, their leader, goes to see Jesus in the dark. Try to call up the governor this week and say, you'd like to have a meeting with her in the dark. See how that goes. Call up the mayor. Say, I'd like to meet you, but I want to meet you in an alley where there's no lights and nobody around. Right? Call your boss. I have the most wonderful staff in the world. And say, I want to meet you in a dark alley Thursday, and I'm not going. Right? In John's gospel, that thing that happens in the darkness is always an indication of evil. In John's gospel, it's always about moving people from the dark to the light. So the fact that this happens in the darkness indicates there's something really troubling here, something really evil. And Nicodemus starts out, remember we're talking about academics, and he says to Jesus, I know you are a great teacher of God. Now that's a big statement. And you know that it's a big statement because Jesus will not say the same thing to Nicodemus. If you continue to follow the conversation, Jesus never calls Nicodemus a teacher of God. He calls him a teacher of the Jews, or most correct translation there, the Judeans. He's a teacher of the Judeans, and that's a political statement. He leads a particular group that is particularly uppity about who's in and who's out. That's how Jesus addresses Nicodemus. But Nicodemus says to Jesus, you are a teacher of God. We know you couldn't do the things you're doing unless you were. And Jesus says to him, well, you just don't understand it. You must be born ananon, which is a Greek word that can mean again or above. Every time it's used in the Gospel of John, it is above. You must be born from above. One of the big themes in the Gospel of John is going up and coming down, going up and coming down. Good stuff goes up and bad stuff comes down. Jesus can do either one. So he's saying you are in the darkness and you must rise up to the light to be a part of God's kingdom. You must raise up to be in the light. But Nicodemus, for all his degrees, and all of his doctorates, and all of the schools he's attended, he doesn't get it. He hears it very literally. And there's a reason for that. Nicodemus is a man who has had a careful plan in his life. He's laid his life out carefully. He's been part of the right organizations, part of the right leadership groups. He's gone to the right schools. He's been in the right fraternities. He's been in the right social organizations. Everything for him is about control. It's very structured and very controlled. And the kind of God that Nicodemus believes in is a Pharisee God. A God that's like a Coke machine. You go up to a Coke machine, you put your money in, you push the Dr. Pepper button, and you want to get a Dr. Pepper out. You expect to get a Dr. Pepper out. If you don't get a Dr. Pepper out, you want your money back. You say the process is wrong. Nicodemus believed in that kind of a God. He believed that if you went to the temple and you did the right things in the temple, you said the right prayers and you gave the right amount of money, then God would have to bless you in a very prescribed, controlled way. If you did those things, God would have to reward you with good health, a great family, a great business, wonderful security, and just lots of goodies. That's what he believed. And now Jesus is saying to him something quite different. You can do all the right things and disaster can still happen to you, Nicodemus. Nicodemus knows that's not right. After all, his mama named him Nicodemus, which means the conqueror of worlds. How's that for a baby name? Conqueror of worlds. Come here, little Billy. Come here, little Susie. It's time for milk. Come here, conqueror of worlds. Time for your, whatever conquerors of world drink, right? I mean, he knew that he was created, put on earth, blessed by God, to take organized shape and form the world the way it should be. And God for him was not a being with which he had a relationship. God for Nicodemus was an appliance. Appliance. You know, if we treat our appliances right, we expect them to do what we want them to do. They have, in a way, promised to do that. And now Jesus is saying, no, none of that's true. That's not how God is. God is like the wind. The wind comes and blows wherever it will, and you cannot predict what the wind will do. Now, saying to a man like Nicodemus that God is like the wind, uncontrollable, that it blows where it will, is about as earth-shattering a thing, head-cracking, numbing thing as you could possibly say. And you get that image of Nicodemus, and he's got his doctorate robe on, and he's sitting over in the corner going, but I know how this is supposed to work. And Jesus is saying it doesn't work like that at all. And to make it even more that way, Jesus goes back to an obscure story in the Old Testament, talking about snakes. Now, I don't know what kind of church you grew up in, but I grew up in a church where occasionally someone would handle a snake as part of the worship service. And I can tell you, you forget about communion, you forget about the potluck. When somebody gets a snake out in worship, then suddenly it's just about the snake. I will just tell you that. And so Jesus starts talking about snakes. And he reminds Nicodemus there was a time the people of Israel were fleeing from Egypt. They were seeking their freedom. They were leaving their bondage behind. They were out in the wilderness. They were down in the Negev, which is the place in Israel where the terrorists shoot the missiles. It's not where our group ever goes, but it's just a big old desert. And he said they were down in the Negev, and they kept running into snakes. And the snakes kept biting people. People kept getting sick. And so Moses does this weird thing. He gets a staff, and he puts a fake little toy snake on it, and he holds it up. And he says to the people, as long as you look at the snake up on this pole, nothing bad will happen to you. If you look away, you're going to get bit by a snake, and you're going to have a tummy ache and feel real bad. But if you keep your eyes on the snake, you're going to be okay. And that's what happens. It's this weird, strange, odd story. You didn't know that was in the Nicodemus story, right? You thought it was all God so loved the world. That's what this is supposed to be. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes shall not perish but will have everlasting life. Oh yeah, and watch out for snakes. That's what it should be. And Nicodemus is just completely lost at this point. He has no idea what's going on. The great teacher has babbled off into snakes. How do you control a guy who talks about the wind and who jabbers on about snakes in the middle of the desert? And Jesus is saying two things that Nicodemus just misses. This is very important. You see, Jesus is saying that in this world in which we live, you can't control everything. You don't have the power, the wisdom, the money, the influence, the personal force of will to control everything. That in this world in which we live, there are snakes everywhere. There's a snake called cancer that you can't control. There's a snake called addiction that you can't control. There's a snake called divorce you can't control. There's a snake called a broken relationship you can't control. There's a snake called loneliness you can't control. There's a snake called losing your job you can't control. There's a snake called losing your money you can't control. There's a snake called brokenness in your family you can't control. There's a snake called your child's in trouble you can't control. There's a snake called we just don't love each other anymore that you can't control. You see, Jesus is saying, Nicodemus, you think you own this world. You think you control it. You think you take all your goodies and you run it into the front of your God machine and you crank the wheels all day long up there on the temple and out pops the blessings that you want. That's not the way it works at all. That we're in a world filled with vipers. And the only hope for us is to keep our eyes focused on the one who will be lifted up, Jesus Christ. It's only when our eyes are focused on Jesus that even though the vipers may bite us, we can survive. It's with our eyes on Jesus that even the snakes of the Negev, when they come and gather around us and strike us, we will feel the pain, but we will survive. It's a wonderful story in the book Blue Like Jazz. And the two characters are talking. They're talking about believing in Jesus or not believing in Jesus. And the one guy says, you know why I believe in Jesus? I believe in Jesus because of penguins. And his buddy says, what? Penguins? What do penguins have to do with Jesus? And he says, well, it's like this. I was doing a lot of research and studying and seeing TV shows on penguins, and it's like this. Penguins go down to the Arctic, and the mother penguins lay their eggs on the ice and leave. They just go away. The mamas go away. And then all these daddy penguins have to come sit on the eggs and keep them from freezing there in the Arctic. And the guys, these men penguins, they have the whole thing figured out. You go stand out on the front against the coldest cold for a shift. And when your shift is over, you move back and another penguin goes out there. You get in the middle where it's nice and warm, get all rejuvenated. And pretty soon you rotate around again. You go sit on that egg and you keep it warm. And then one day, I would like to tell this story to Nicodemus myself. And then one day, those little penguin eggs start to hatch. And guess what? For some reason, nobody can explain, on that very day, all of the mother penguins return. And they've been eating and gobbling down fish, and they come back and they start slurping up the fish and feeding those baby penguins. And he looks at his friend, he says, that's why I believe in Jesus. He said, his buddy said, I still don't think I get it. He says, because there's something inside of those penguins that just connects them to all of creation and all of life. It's like a radar. And I have that radar too. None of that happens by accident. There's a plan, there's a force behind it. And that force is reaching out, claiming me and loving me too. My favorite verse in this story is that Jesus did not come to the world to condemn the world, but so that the world might be saved through him. When I was a little kid in church, they never got to that verse. They did John 3:16 and then started talking about the list, who was in, who was out. Don't you want to be on the good list, not the bad list? They never got to these words. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus is not a fireman that runs through the burning house telling people, stay here, you deserve it. Stay here, you're about to get what you deserve. Jesus is a person that runs through the house telling everyone to get out of the burning house, runs to the person who started the fire, scoops him up and carries him out on his shoulder. That's what the text says. That's what Jesus said to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is as bumfuzzled and confused by it as he can possibly be. This concept of a God who comes and seeks us, who offers his Son to us for our salvation, is just as confusing as it can be to a man who has put himself in a place in life where he thinks he controls his world and doesn't need anyone else. Now, there is a catch in the passage if you read it. If you read it, Jesus says, now you have to come to the light. You have to want to be saved. When I was undergoing lifeguard training, I was shocked to occasionally discover a person who did not want to be saved. There were people that didn't want to be. You have to want to be saved. You have to receive and accept the gift that Christ has given you. Fred Craddock is maybe the greatest preacher in American history, certainly one of the top, and taught here in Oklahoma for many years. And was just a great, great, great man, a great preaching teacher and a great preacher. He tells the story of growing up, back I think it was Tennessee where he grew up, and his mother was very religious. She went to church 4 or 5 times a week. His father did not go. His father was very cynical about religion. In fact, if somebody would mention religion to his dad would say, well, they just want my name on the roll. That makes the preacher look good, get more names on the roll. Or they just want my pledge. All they want is my money. They don't care a thing about me. They want my money. And it would go year after year like that. Fred's mother, anytime there was an evangelist come to town doing a revival, she would drag the poor guy over there to meet her husband so her husband could ream the guy out. You know, oh, you don't care about me. You just want me to come down to your meeting and bring some money. And it went on like that for years. One year, when Fred was away in college, his dad got cancer. And Fred came home to see his father. He went into the hospital room. He could barely get into the hospital room because everywhere in that hospital room there were plants. Plants from his mother's Sunday school class, from his mother's women's Bible study, from his mother's church, from friends all throughout the church. There were plans, there were gifts, there were cards. He read the cards. We're praying for you, Mr. Craddock, we're praying for you to be healed. Card after card, everything from church people and nothing from his dad's other friends. who wouldn't step in the hospital because they didn't want to be around sick people. And so Fred went to his dad and he said, Dad, he goes, this is just amazing. You've never gone to church, and look at how all these Christian people have responded to you. And by then, Mr. Craddock, who had cancer of the throat, couldn't speak, so he wrote on a napkin box a quote from Hamlet. When you tell my story, tell it in pain. In pain. And then Craddock held his dad's hand, and he said, Daddy, what is your story? And his father wrote on the cardboard box, I was wrong. Jesus comes to us, meets us in the night where we are, brings with him the light and the opportunity to receive God's gifts. It's not our name he wants. It's not our offering he's after. It's our very heart. It's our love. But we are free to accept or reject what Jesus Christ comes to offer. Nicodemus meets Jesus 2 more times. In the 7th chapter of the Gospel of John, the Pharisees descend on Jesus, ready to tie him up, take him off to be tried and crucified. And Nicodemus defends him. And then in the late closing chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus is there being crucified. His disciples flee. The crowds that praised him are gone. The Christ dies on the cross, broken and bleeding. And Nicodemus has made his decision to follow Jesus. He is the one who places the ladder up against the cross. It is Nicodemus who pulls the bloodied hands of Christ away from the nails that bind him to that tree. It is Nicodemus who carries him down from that place of torture and death. It is Nicodemus with Joseph of Arimathea who take Christ for burial. But then John says this odd, strange thing about Nicodemus. It seems that to bury Jesus, Nicodemus has brought myrrh. Now, we remember myrrh. The symbol of that was brought to Jesus' birth. Now, Nicodemus has come like one who came at Jesus' birth bringing myrrh. But he hasn't brought the normal amount, a little bitty jar of the stuff. He has brought 100 pounds of myrrh. It's extravagant. It's extraordinary. It's unreasonably generous. It would be like if you had a death in your family and someone came to you and said, here is $100 million to go buy the casket. It is the amount of myrrh prescribed for the burial of a king of Israel. And Nicodemus is no longer the man with the question. He is now the servant of the king. This is the word of God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Each of us has to decide how we